Everybody, we're on chapter 4 tonight. Got a lot of people online. I got to apologize for the disclaimer. I walked out and didn't put my PowerPoint stick in my pocket to bring my slides tonight. So what little bit you're going to see is old school. I'm not sure how well you can even see what I put up here on the board, but y'all may just have to move forward. That's the solution for not being able to see it if you're here. I think we probably have the camera zoomed in about as far as we can, but hopefully you have to listen to follow along. You turn in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 4. That's where we're going to be tonight. You've got it in your hands if you're here in the auditorium here. Chapter 4 is the last couple of pages in your handout. And so you've got at least the same version, everybody, to refer to as far as class is concerned. Glad to have everybody online with us. Got a lot of people doing that. That's encouraging. And glad to see everybody here tonight, too. Daniel is an interesting book because it's unique in the way that it handles the historical aspects of the time that it's written in by Daniel. And then the second half of the book we're going to see is going to be very different. But we see glimpses of these in dreams and interpretations and Daniel's interaction with Nebuchadnezzar in the first part of the book as well. So we've got a little training manual kind of a thing going on in the first part of the book to help prepare us for the visions to come that won't have that interaction, dialogue, and clear interpretations given to us of these dreams that Nebuchadnezzar's having that Daniel interprets. The second half of the book, we're going to get Daniel's dreams. And there's not going to be that dialogue of interaction. And this is exactly what it all means. So we'll have a lot more to discuss in the second half of the book. But I want us to think just a moment about what we're seeing here in chapter 4 and what we have seen thus far. When we read chapter 1, we've given every chapter so far a title. And in chapter 1, we said that God's main point for the Hebrews to learn from this in chapter 1 is that God is the protector of the captives. If you think back about what's in chapter 1, about how did he protect Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's peers? Did it look obvious at the beginning in this story that they were going to be protected? On the surface, did it even look like they were protected? Because if they were protected, man would say what? They would have been left in Jerusalem nice and safe, right? They would have been left with their families behind the walls of Jerusalem, not to be carried away into this captivity. But now they're in captivity. They're a long way from home. They're not surrounded with anything that's familiar to them except their God. And so he is their protector. And so the second chapter, we see that God is the revealer of the future, because now we're introduced to Nebuchadnezzar the king, and he's a dreamer, isn't he? And he has a dream that no one can interpret except God. And God gives that interpretation to Daniel, who then gives it to Nebuchadnezzar. And we see the relationship between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar begin. And we see glimpses of this relationship through the first 6 chapters in the book. So, and we're going to see more of it tonight, even more so. And there's a few phrases we'll try to draw attention to that indicate by the time of chapter 4, there seems to be a very real relationship between Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel. And it's changed a bit. It's matured. There's a little more closeness, it seems, than at the initial, when he's just one of many in Nebuchadnezzar's university of learning that he's put these academic children into from all over his empire as a way to raise them the Babylonian way. All right. And so in chapter 2, we see that God's the revealer of the future. Now, why is that important for Israel to know in this time frame? Why is that lesson important for Israel? God is a revealer of the future.
They probably want to know if they're ever going to go home.
Seems like an interesting proposition to ask, reasonable, right? Are we going back? Or are all bets off? Have we so messed up this relationship with God and been so wicked, he's casting us aside like all the other nations for their wickedness? Why did Abraham not receive the promised land in his time? What's one phrase that would indicate that? The iniquity of what? The iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full, or was not yet fulfilled. Well, who are the Amorites? They were the occupants of the promised land. They were the nation that lived in Israel or Palestine at that time. And because their wickedness had not reached its fulfillment of time in God's eyes, Abraham did not receive the promised land, even though it was promised to him and his descendants. He didn't get it himself, did he? What's the only property he owned? Just a side note. This will win you a point in trivia, Bible trivia. What's the only land Abraham ever owned in the promised land? Cave of Machpelah. Who's buried there for bonus points of 10? Can we name them? I'm not sure I can. I shouldn't have put myself in every answer question. Teacher doesn't know the answer to. All right. Sarah is the purpose for the purchase of the Cave of Machpelah. Who else was buried there?
Rachel.
Not Rachel.
Rebecca.
No. Leah is buried in the Cave of Machpelah. Jacob's wife. And also who else? I just spilled the beans on that one. Jacob is later to be buried in the Cave of Machpelah. And when he dies in Egypt, they all return and they bury him in the Cave of Machpelah. I think it's just those three that we know for certain. But that's the only property that Abraham ever owned in the land. And that might be an interesting thing to do a little more dialogue on, see if there's any facts in there we need to straighten out or add to. But my point is, in chapter 2, God is a revealer of the future, because God, in this revelation to Nebuchadnezzar, by extension, he's also revealing it to Israel. And what does he tell Israel through this dream to Nebuchadnezzar, the great king dreamer? What do we got over here? What's my code stand for? Nebuchadnezzar gets this vision of this statue, right? And it's made up of different parts, and those parts represent future kingdoms, don't they? And those future kingdoms are who? The Babylonian kingdom or empire, the Persian empire, the Greek empire, and lastly, the Roman empire. And during the days of these kings, a kingdom would come that would be everlasting in its nature. So here is Nebuchadnezzar, this pagan king, and he is elevated to the altitude or vista of God's prophets. And he is able to see these mountaintops in God's timeline of his eternal purpose. Does Nebuchadnezzar get to see everything about all the details of all of these four empires? No. However, how impressive and even daunting, and we'll come across this issue tonight in chapter 4 for Nebuchadnezzar, this daunting weight that he receives as a man, king though he may be, of knowing the future. And what does he do with that? Knowing these entire empires are coming, and his empire is what? What's going to happen one day? It's going to fall. It's going to go away. And then this empire is going to rise and be at a higher altitude as his. And then this empire is going to rise and be as high of an altitude as theirs. And then Rome comes, and it's going to be just as high as theirs. You think through all that if you're Daniel, and what comes to be your conclusion about you? Not very important, are you? He's not just the king as though he is in the moment. What is he compared to God's timeline? He is a drop in the bucket. But does that affect his humility as it should? Not yet. But in Daniel 4, we're going to see how God attempts to correct the humility and the humbleness of this great king in his empire at the moment. And he's been given great insight. Knowing this alone would give him tremendous wisdom once he began to think upon what God had revealed to him through Daniel. And so we see he's a revealer of the future. Why is this important for Israel to know? That fourth empire, fifth, the kingdom that will come and never dissipate, is going to be God's kingdom. And do you not think that they can take the prophets and then look at what Daniel has interpreted of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams and then intersect them and say, at the time of these kings, the eternal king, God's king, the Messiah will come? Is that important for Israel to know? Let's reverse engineer that. If after all of these empires, including the one that has them captive, this eternal kingdom comes and it's the Messiah, and you know all these other prophets about the Messiah, the king of Israel, God's kingdom will come, what does that mean has to still exist at that time?
People. His people.
Israel, his people still have to exist at that time for the Messiah to come of the lineage of David, of the tribe of Judah, to be born in Bethlehem, and all the prophecies we know about the Messiah. That means he's not going to do away with us. That means we're still important to God. That means he's still going to fulfill his promises to us. And all of those things give what to the captives? What does it give them? Hope. It gives them hope. Is that important when you're in prison? What do people in prison look forward to? The date of their release, right? You know, when people go to prison, oftentimes they mark the days. But you know, at some point when they know their release date or their parole date, what do they start doing then? Marking backwards. They start counting down the days. Do you ever do that in like grade school or maybe junior high? How many more days till we're out? How many more days till we're out? You know, 7 more days to Christmas vacation. Right? We do that. It's natural. So Israel, it receives this message. It is not a small message for them to know. And then we move into chapter 3, and we saw what last week? God is not only a God of the protector of the captives, a revealer of the future. He is also what? He is the God, the Lord of what? Fire. Now, what did we see in chapter 3 that was important for Israel to know? Out of that fiery furnace. This is the chapter where Daniel's not even mentioned. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are the stars of chapter 3 that all of Israel is going to be looking toward. So what is it that we get if you're an Israelite in captivity from Daniel chapter 3?
God's going to protect us.
Still this theme of protection? Absolutely. Is it something far off? Or after you read chapter 3, is God interested at the personal level? It's very personal. I mean, it's on this grand stage, right? But who's involved? All of Israel, like in Esther's time, where the entire nation was threatened? Who's threatened here? Just 3 guys. And who gets involved? God does. An angel of God enters the fire with them. So, make the analogy. They're in the fire of captivity, this trial of captivity, this fiery furnace. What does fire do to precious metals and metals? How do you get 18-karat gold out of a nugget? What do you have to do to it to get the fineness out of it? You have to smelter it. You have to apply the fire. What does that do to the nature of the nugget? Purifies it. It changes it forever. It purifies it. And what does it get rid of?
Dross.
All the dross. Yeah, you can skim that dross off. It floats to the top. It goes to the sides. It evaporates on its own. The weaker metals will even dissipate. but gold doesn't, right? And that's the whole premise behind it all. And at the end of the fiery trial, that this, I believe, represents in the demonstrative illustration that is being given by God to his people, what's going to come out the other end? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, unscathed and promoted even higher and blessed even greater than they were at the beginning. So what does that mean? What's that message for Israel feel like? What does that look like? We're going to come through this and we're going to come out the other end. And what are we going to be like? Where's the dross? Where's the impurities? Where is whatever it was that was among us that put us into this sorry mess in the first place? Where does it get left? It gets left in the fire of captivity. And we see that, don't we? Because what happened, and we mentioned this last week, idolatry among the people. Were they idol worshipers when they went into captivity? Israel as a whole?
Yes.
I know Daniel was not, but yes, they were. As a people, they still were. Were they an idolatrous people when they came out of captivity?
No.
Never again will you see that issue. And I'm telling you, it is stupefying to understand how did that happen in 70 years, when for 300 years, more than that, 400 years, all the prophets, all the kings, and all the righteous people, all the judges, Moses, Joshua among them, could not get that out of the people. But 70 years in captivity did. It's amazing. So chapter 3, don't miss the important lesson from chapter 3 is not just God protects his people, protected Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And though it is a great lesson of, God is there for you and you're in your own fiery furnace. But on the national platform, Israel needed to know that what they're going through, they're going to come out the other end and God is going to recognize them. And this is what they're going through is necessary. It's necessary. And if they're righteous and they're in sync with God's plan, you're going to endure that, aren't you? As part of the process. Why do you endure unpleasant medical procedures on you? Just so the doctors can experiment? Just so that they can have better knowledge of the human body? That's not why I go to the doctor and get my vaccinations and my shots and my surgeries that I've had to have. What do I want out of it?
They've promised something that this is going to improve.
This is going to make it better for you. This is going to be an improvement for you, right? And God, the great physician, makes no mistakes. God does not make mistakes. He knows what these people need. This patient of his is sick, and he is putting them through this fiery trial, this captivity, to heal them of their terminal illness. And when they come out, they will be idol-free. Without pain? Oh no. There's going to be pain associated with this. There's going to be hardships when they get back in the land after the captivity to rebuild, right? Ezra, Nehemiah, we could study those books and see that it won't be easy, but they will come back pure and prepared. It's fascinating, inspiring, really, when we think about it. So now we get to chapter 4, and this story continues to build for Israel, okay? Israel's the audience for the book of Daniel, okay? We can learn things for us. We can make applications for us. We get the 20/20 hindsight and reading back at it to understand exactly these kingdoms and see how it all played out into the history of mankind and get great validation from all this. But make no mistake, the book of Daniel is for the Hebrews. It's for the Hebrews. All right, let's get into the text then and the specific lessons. Let's look at chapter 4. And if we have to put a title on the chapter 4, we're going to call it God is the humbler of the proud. Okay, God is the humbler of the proud. And you've got in your notes here. It is a fairly long chapter. I've wrestled with how to get through this in the time, and I'm just not going to read the chapter, okay? But we're going to look through it in sections. And I've got the chapter, and in your notes, it's the same. It's broken into 4 parts. The first 18 verses, you're going to read, the main context here is the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. It's going to read very similar to the earlier chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. He brings in wise men to interpret it for him, and nobody can interpret it. And this time he doesn't play any games with them and ask them to tell me the dream and the interpretation. He tells them the dream, and they still can't interpret it for him. Finally, Daniel comes onto the stage, and in the verses 19 through 27, Daniel interprets the dream. And then in verse 28 through 33, we're going to see the dream fulfilled and then demonstrated. And then 34 through 37, we're going to see Nebuchadnezzar's confession concerning Jehovah God of the lesson learned from the demonstration that's in chapter 4. Okay, so as we look at this visionary dream with its actual demonstration in chapter 4, let's get into the text. In verses 1 through 3, and actually in verse 2, I believe it is, there's a phrase that says, "It hath seemed good unto me to show the signs and the wonders of the Most High God that he hath wrought in me." It has seemed good unto me to show. So what was the motivation behind this showing by Nebuchadnezzar of sharing his dreams? What's his motivation? No mystery here. What does he say?
Showing the greatness of God.
Yeah, it seems to be a good thing to do. So that's his motivation. Okay, no hidden agendas here by Nebuchadnezzar. This just seems to be a good thing to do, is to share God's wisdom, God's dreams with other people. What's the problem with that for Nebuchadnezzar? He's got a problem. He wants to share God's message that God has given him, but what's Nebuchadnezzar's problem? He doesn't understand the message. He's got the message. It'd be like if I received it in another language and I didn't, if I got the Bible in French, I don't read French. So I can't share it in French. So what do I have to do? I have to have somebody read French to me and read me that message. Okay. And so I'm getting to a point with that. And he says, among other things, in verse 3, he wants to share this because he says, how great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. And then here's an interesting phrase by Nebuchadnezzar. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. How did Nebuchadnezzar know that? He still remembers chapter 2, doesn't he? Everlasting kingdom. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar is testifying and witnessing to the eventuality of the everlasting kingdom of God is going to come. And what else about the everlasting nature of God's kingdom? Is God in power and in control now? Yes, he is. God is in control now. And Nebuchadnezzar is identifying that. And so we see that. It's overwhelming for him. But what we can learn from this, Gable, turn over to Philippians 3 and verse 7. Read it for us, Philippians 3, 7 through 14.
7 through 14.
Yep.
But what things were gained to me, these I have counted loss for Christ. Yet indeed I also count all things lost for the excellence of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and count them as rubbish, that I may gain Christ, and be found in him, not having my own righteousness, which is from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness which is from God by faith, that I may know him in the power of his resurrection, in the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death, if by any means I may attain to the resurrection from the dead. Not that I have already attained, or am already perfected, but I press on, that I may lay hold of that for which Christ Jesus has also laid hold of me. Brethren, I do not count myself to have apprehended, but one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forward to those things which are ahead. I press toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus.
I press onward to the upward call of God. If Paul, the apostle, did not yet have firm grasp and total understanding of everything associated with the mystery of Christ before he started preaching the gospel, why do we think we have to do that? Nebuchadnezzar wanted to share this vision because it seemed like the right thing to do. He didn't understand everything. He didn't understand all the values and all the issues around each and every single empire. He just was given the grand overview. And now that he receives this other dream about this great tree that's going to be cut down and left as a stump, he's eager to share it. Does he understand it all? No, but that doesn't stop this king from knowing enough to know this is a good message. I need to get it out there and get it explained. I got it from God. I need to get it explained so we all understand it, including myself. But how do we, by extension, this is a side lesson. How do we look at what we know? Well, oftentimes we just think, I just don't know enough to teach my neighbor. What if they ask hard questions I don't understand? How do I deal with that? Paul ties the acquisition of knowledge with the attainment of the prize. Think about that. The acquisition of the knowledge is tied to the prize. It's not the prize is given to you after you get and acquire all the knowledge. That's not what Paul says in Philippians chapter 3. Brethren, I think sometimes we're afraid to stand up and tell our story because it's not finished yet. And we think because it's not finished yet and we don't have all the understanding yet, we just can't share it because we don't know how it's all going to turn out, or we don't understand every nuance of what we're trying to teach others. We can't do that. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't do that here. And I think it's an important point for us to think about. He says likewise on in chapter 4 through 7 in this chapter now, if we can turn back again into chapter 4. He says in verse 5, I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. And look how he tries to solve it. It is interesting. He saw, as here's one of the mightiest men, but he saw this dream and it invades his peace of mind. And how does he try to solve it?
It's the magicians.
He goes back to these magicians and wise men and Chaldeans. He'd learned that that was not a reliable source. But and here's the issue that still troubles us a bit about Nebuchadnezzar. Why does he go to these men? How does he still view Daniel and Daniel's God? Does he view Jehovah and Daniel and their connectivity to one another? Does he view Jehovah as his God? No, he uses phrases in chapter 4 that indicates that Jehovah is mighty and powerful and wondrous, and he is Daniel's God. But our God, he uses those terminologies, our God, my God versus Jehovah's. My God is nothing compared to Jehovah, but he's still tied to his God. So maybe that's for political purposes. Maybe there's things associated with that. He has not come to accept that yet. And so he's going to be humbled by Daniel's God and proven and shown once again that his God is nothing but wood and the figment of man's imagination compared to Jehovah. But he says, I had this dream. I brought in all these soothsayers. I told them the dream, but nobody could make it known. Verse 8, and this is interesting in verse 8. But at the last, Daniel came in. Now, the question is, why didn't he come in at the first? If you were Nebuchadnezzar and you'd had behind you already chapter 2 and chapter 4, okay, why would you have not gone and got Daniel first? Well, the scripture doesn't say. We can't say for sure on that. Maybe Daniel wasn't available right away. Maybe he was a distance away. We don't know why all this happened. Maybe the Chaldeans just needed to be pacified, so they got first up, and Nebuchadnezzar knew good and well that they weren't going to be able to do anything for him, but he had to go through the motions. I don't know. But at the last, Daniel came in. And what does he say about Daniel? The spirit of the holy gods is in thee. So Nebuchadnezzar knows some things, but does he have it all figured out yet? No, he doesn't. The spirit of the holy gods, plural, is in thee. Verse 8. And let me make sure I'm making that right out. And in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I told the dream before him, saying, okay. And so now he shares in verse 9 the dream. Okay, and down through about verse 17 is where the dream is. And so we see that's an indicating phrase that Nebuchadnezzar has not yet learned his entire lesson from God that has been placed before him. And so we need to keep that in mind when we read his words in this chapter, is he hasn't learned his whole lesson from God. Look at verse 10. Thus were the visions. So he recites this dream. And if you notice, as we read through 10 through 17, actually starts in about verse 12. He sees this big tree, and the fruit thereof, there was much leaves and fruit on it, and in it was food for all. And there was the beast of the field had shadow under it. The birds of the heaven dwelt in the branches thereof, and all the flesh was fed from it. Verse 14, it was hewn down. The angel came down and said, cut down the tree, and it was hewn down, and cut off its branches, and shake off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. And the beast will get away from under it, and the fowls from its branches. Not personal at all, is it? It. How many times I read it now in those three verses? 10 times, 12 times? Notice the shift. Verse 15, its roots will be left with the stump, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven. And now look at this. And let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. We're still talking about the stump, and it has gone from it to his. Now look at verse 16. Let his heart be changed from man's. Let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. There's a big shift here. And this is all Nebuchadnezzar giving the rendition, right? And so he finishes telling this dream now to Daniel. And so we already, because of the change of these pronouns, we see a hint of who the tree is, don't we? And what is being all talked about here. And he says, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, verse 17, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the lowest of men. Wow. I thought Nebuchadnezzar was the king of the head of gold in the 4 kingdoms, the golden kingdom. And the head of that golden kingdom was Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest of all men. What does verse 17 say about him? Is he the greatest of all men? It says he's the lowest of men. You see, this is God's viewpoint. God's viewpoint. And so then we see, starting in verse 19, we see now Daniel is going to give the explanation of all this. And it's all going to come together for us, okay? And starting in verse 19, we see Daniel, Belteshazzar, was stricken dumb. What I think that means simply is he was so awed by the interpretation of what he's heard and what he's been given. He hesitates to share it with Nebuchadnezzar, who in man's eyes is the greatest of all men. And now he's going to have to tell him, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the lowest of all men. When was the last time that anybody representing Jehovah confronted Nebuchadnezzar about how great he was? How'd that turn out? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? How did Nebuchadnezzar react when they said, we're not going to bow down to you because you're just a man? We serve God and only God. How angry?
Furious.
Yeah, like purple in the face wrath, right? I mean, it says he was very wroth. So much so he sacrificed his men to make the furnace, what? How many times hotter? 7 times, 10 times hotter, right? He's so mad. He doesn't just want to burn them up. He wants to toast them crispy. He's so mad at him. And so now Daniel's got a similar message to him that he's got to share with him. So he hesitates here. In 1 Samuel chapter 3, we see a similar instance between Eli and his protege Samuel. Samuel gets a vision at the night, doesn't he? Remember, he's a little boy. And who calls out to him? Eli. God does. Samuel. Samuel. And he, yes, Lord, I'm here. And he runs and wakes Eli up. And he says, you called? He said, I didn't call you. Go back to bed. And this went on like 3 times. And finally he says, you go back to bed. And next time you answer, here am I, Lord. And you find out from the Lord what he wants to know. And then he did. And now what? What does Samuel then have to do? Because Eli's like the next morning, he's like, what did he tell you? What did he say? What does what does Samuel have to say to Eli? Is it a happy message for Eli? Your sons are going to die. Not a good message. And so now Daniel's kind of put in a kind of a similar situation as Samuel was long before Daniel's time. And so he didn't shirk from his duties. He presents it to him, verses 20 through 22. The tree that thou sawest, it is you. He doesn't mix words, does he? When you have an unhappy message for somebody, what's the best way to give it? Don't sugarcoat it. Don't delay it. You know, if somebody's got to tell me something bad, just bring it straight at me. Just tell me. I'm fired? Okay. Don't dance around it. Don't talk about all my past accomplishments and all this other stuff. Just tell me the company's had to go a different direction and I'm not it. Okay. You can deal with that, right? And so Samuel does that here, or Daniel does that right here. He goes and says, the tree you saw, this grand tree that everything in the world is eating from and benefiting from, that's you. And then it gets cut down. And the tree as a stump is going to be you too. Only you're going to be brought down and humiliated. But we're not going to uproot the stump. The stump's still going to be there. And there's going to come a period of time where that stump is going to be regrown into a tree and it will be better than it was before. It will yet return intact and Nebuchadnezzar will return from being humiliated. Now, what a blow all of this must have been to the king's ego, because God is going to show Nebuchadnezzar that the kingdom could get along just fine without him. You're going to cut off the head of this kingdom and it doesn't matter, because who's in control again? God's in control. Does he need Nebuchadnezzar to run the Babylonian Empire to achieve what he's got planned? No, doesn't need Nebuchadnezzar for nothing. And so he's going to set him down and then put him back after he's taught him the lesson. And how humiliated is Nebuchadnezzar going to be? Is he just going to lose election and 4 years later run for re-election and win his seat back? That's not much humility learning there, is it? Well, maybe some. But this is different, because what's going to happen to him during this period of time, this metaphorical 7 days, this complete period of time for God of a certain duration, what's going to happen? He's going to do what?
He's going to live like an animal.
He's going to live like the beast of the field. He's going to have to live like an animal and eat grass. Okay. In the meantime, what's happening with the kingdom? Is it falling apart? Nope. It's going on just fine. Everybody's taking care of things. King's out there crazy as a loon. Doesn't matter. Kingdom's still doing fine. What does that do to his ego? Removes it, doesn't it? Removes it. We don't have that issue today, do we? This place can fall apart without me. I used to think that when I retired after almost 35 years in the Federal Aviation Administration. I worked at headquarters, and man, I had so many different offices and so many different windows that looking out of those two buildings, so many different places. And I knew so many people, and I had my hands into so many different things and going on. I thought, good night, I'm going to retire and they're going to just blow my phone up for 6 months. It's going to be like I never got out the door. And you know what happened? Same thing that happened to everybody else who retired before me. There were people waiting to take my place. And I think I got like 3 emails and 1 phone call because everybody picked everything up and just went along just fine without Martin there. Now, that's a little deflating, isn't it? I will tell you, that's not a question. That is a little deflating, period, demonstrative sentence. Because Martin thought he was pretty neat. It's pretty special. Senior advisor. Not many of those in that building. I was one. It was pretty fun having your hands on everything and knowing everything. And then all of a sudden, back pasture. Put out to pasture. You know, there aren't many horses that get put out to pasture that people actually come and visit for years and years. Secretariat was an exception to that. People used to go to Calumet Farms to see Secretariat years after he finished racing. You could go by and see him out in the pasture. But you know what? Who won the Kentucky Derby the year after Secretariat? Oh, nobody knows? Me neither. But you know what? The next year, he got retired. And he spent the rest of his life in pasture too. You think anybody came to see him? No. What happened to Aladar? The horse that came in second to Secretariat all those years. Nobody ever came and visited him out in the pasture when he was 20 years old. It doesn't matter, folks. That's the whole point of chapter 4 for us. Okay. But we look into it. In the time we've got remaining, we can't miss this I'm indispensable syndrome and see that it has no place in God's eternal plan. It doesn't have that idea of I'm indispensable has no place in New Testament covenant theology, and it had no place in this aspect of God's covenant with his people and his eternal plan. Because what did the Hebrew need to learn from this? The Hebrew nation. Are they indispensable in God's plan? What did Jesus say about them when they got into that contest back and forth with them, the Pharisees? We're children of who? Abraham. And what was said to them in return? God can raise up children of Abraham from these stones. Does God need Israel? Not for a minute. Did they get to be God's chosen people because they were the most righteous people on the planet? They weren't at the beginning and they never were. God doesn't need Israel for this plan. Israel needs God. All of this happened in God's eternal plan because he loves man and he chose Israel as an instrument for that plan. And so Nebuchadnezzar is going to learn this, but Israel is to learn that from this chapter, is that God not only is in control of these nations, he will put in charge whoever he wants to from the lowest of men, and it won't make a difference. It won't make a difference. And so he eats grass for 7 days. All of this happened after about a period of about verse 29 for about 12 months. About a year goes by after all this vision. And then all of this happens to Nebuchadnezzar, just as the vision foretold. And he says in verse 30, this great Babylon that I have built, maybe he's looking at the hanging gardens of Babylon or any of these things. And then God strikes him down and makes him eat grass as this animal in the field. And as we said, the empire just continues. Verse 31, there fell a voice from heaven. The voice fell, the king fell, and the king's arrogance fell. There's a lot for us to think about there when we get a little too high on our horse or a little too narcissistic in what we think about ourselves or post on Facebook. And then in verse 34 through 37, we see the confession. After all of this is concluded, Nebuchadnezzar is restored. Verse 34, mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed and praised the Most High. Notice we see the absence of pagan terminology now in Nebuchadnezzar's phraseology there, isn't it? This isn't that I'm praising the Most High of the gods. No, there's now one God in Nebuchadnezzar's mind here, at least at this moment, and he is praising Jehovah, Yahweh. Daniel, I think, probably helped him understand more about God in all of this. The point is, though, that when Nebuchadnezzar turned to God, God was there. God was there for Nebuchadnezzar when he turned to him. Now, what's the message for Israel in that? What's the message in the prodigal son when the prodigal son looked around that pigsty and said, I sure am hungry. I'd rather be a servant of my father than to be his son. He would treat me better than this. I'm going to get up and go home. Is that not exactly what Israel was told to do and got to do in the captivity and the remnant return? I am willing to be your servant, God. Take me home. And he did, because he was there when they turned back to him without the idols. They lived in pigsty of idolatry for centuries. And they finally looked around and said, I just want to go home with my father. Now you can throw, and I can throw a lot of rocks at Israel in the time between the periods of the Testament and even the New Testament times of where they all went and their sects and all of these things. But I'll tell you one thing, you've got to appreciate the exiles that marched back home and what they did with Ezra and Nehemiah and Zechariah. They built that temple. They rebuilt that city of God in their mind, according to God's plan, and they prepared the way for the Messiah. It's a beautiful story. Joni had a comment.
I was just trying to make a connection between Nebuchadnezzar and the events of this time period and the kingdoms that come and the final one that's going to come, and the visitors that come to Jesus Christ when he was born. And some of the first ones that come were magi from the east, and they could still read stars. They were very adept at that in that culture, and they knew this was special, but somehow, and I lean towards the side of error, thinking that maybe somewhere through all of this preservation that they knew what was going to happen, the time was right, things were right, and they came looking for the king, and they came bringing appropriate gifts for that king.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. Yeah, the threads of all of this and the future threads with what's happening here, I don't think it's just coincidence. I think there's threads there. It says that the lords of Babylon sought him out when he returned to his right mind and gave his praise to God. The Lord sought him out and he returned to his seat, Nebuchadnezzar did. And with the things he's saying about the Most High God here, Jehovah, in their kingdom, what does that do for Israel? What does it do for them? Now, this is not Persia who's going to allow them to go back. But what does that do for them?
It builds their faith.
It demonstrates bright moments for them. It builds their faith. Exactly right. So when you feel yourself in the midst of hardships and trials and things, and you look at this mountain you have to overcome, and it looks and appears overwhelming, just remember, God is there. He is there for me. He's there for you. And you can overcome. He will guide us. Turn to him. Leave your humility, or your arrogance rather. Leave your arrogance. Turn with your humility to him. And that's hard. That's hard to let go of the wheel. right? Of your own life sometimes. Because we just live in a society that it's all about, I can do what I want to do, when I want to do it, how I want to do it, and just stick it to the Lord. Right? And just say, he'll take what I give him. I know. You will not. So, I mean, that's, so many have that idea today, that you can do what you want to do. Can Nebuchadnezzar do what he wanted to do? How was he reminded of what was really going on? What was really the truth of the situation? Who's in control? God is in control. What does that mean for me on the individual level? It doesn't matter who you think you are the lowest of men. And I can put anybody in charge of these kingdoms and get out of them when I need. So Israel may be down, but they are no means out. Because somewhere in that group of exiles is the lineage of David that's going to turn the remnant and migrate and settle in Nazareth of the tribe of Judah in all this mix. And someday their descendant will be Jesus Christ. It's beautiful. It's going to come from these people that are enduring this fiery furnace. All right, Joel, just a minute. We'll get your comment in chapter 5. Just to give you a heads up, I've got notes up here. If you want to take them, you can. Otherwise, I'll hand them out next week. I like giving them out a week as we talk through it, but you can certainly take them if you want to. God is going to be an avenger of his honor in chapter 5. So we're going to see Nebuchadnezzar only mentioned as an ancestor in chapter 5, okay, of Belshazzar, as your father, right? But so we're going to leave Nebuchadnezzar behind as we go into chapter 5, and that means a lot of years have gone by between 4 and 5. And we're going to see Nebuchadnezzar's son being now dealt with some of these same lessons you have thought he would have learned. And boy, he sure wished he could have learned them. He would have learned them from what we're going to see in chapter 5, right? We're going to accelerate back into this chart here and get into this valley between the two. This is Daniel chapter 5 right here, between B and P. Okay, because we're going to see the Persians coming in chapter 5. And we're going to see a new mountaintop begin to develop. Okay, Larry had a comment.
Yes, briefly, the ones who stayed that didn't go back, God used them too, when in terms of their descendants, in terms of when the gospel was preached, we had the Jews scattered. It's
Yes.
fascinating how God planned in all directions here in fulfilling his will. We can look back now and say, oh, wow.
Yep.
Who would have ever imagined it would have worked with both groups?
There is an actual figure or number of those who return. I forget exactly where it is, but it is a small, minute part of those who were carried away in captivity. Very small percentage. The rest become part of the diaspora, as Larry's referring to. Okay, any other comments or questions? Guys, there is so much here that affects the New Testament and all the way through the plan of redemption. And there are fantastic lessons for us to learn from Israel in this. And I'm trying to bring those out to make sure that we understand God did these things on purpose for Israel's benefit. Okay, all right, we'll do chapter 5 next week. Thanks for y'all's attention.